I'm the managing director of the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism, also known as IPSA. So if I use that acronym, you'll know what I'm talking about. We have a really fabulous event today with Professor Cynthia Miller-Idriss. And you should know, we had an earlier event with her today that was with graduate students, and it was a terrific conversation. So I expect more of the same. Just to let you know how this event will go, Cynthia's going to lecture for us, and then we'll take questions. We're also going to be taking questions online. And that brings us to an important note. This event, like all IPSA events, is being live streamed. So while you will not be on camera, if you ask a question, your voice will be on our live stream. So just a warning to all of you if anyone is sensitive to that, but we will also not be stating your names. So having said that, let me ask a quick question. How many students do we have in the audience? If you'd raise your hand. Terrific. If you're a student, I have a free copy of Cynthia's book, Hate in the Homeland, for you. For those of you who are unhappy that you are not students, if you want to, students come first. Leave your name with me if you'd like a copy of the book, and I will see if I can get you one, but we are running out of them. And my phone is ringing, of course. Nobody pay attention to that. So a couple of quick thank yous. I want to say thank you to the woman taking a picture, Sarit Katan-Grivitz, who is our acting interim director of IPSA. Thank you very much for your support. I want to thank our postdoctoral associate, Claire Aubin, who did a great job interviewing Cynthia this afternoon. And I want to thank, at the back of the room, Inessa Leskova. Without her, these events don't happen. Thank you very much. And in the front row, Kay Rollins, who is a first-year history graduate student, and we're thrilled to have her helping out with IPSA events. Hint, hint, if there are other students that would like to get involved with IPSA, just let me know. And on that note, if you do enjoy this lecture, perhaps enjoy is not the correct word. If you are intrigued by this lecture and you'd like to know more of what IPSA does, we do have a listserv. So please go to our website, sign up for that. Or again, my name is Linda, and I'd be very happy to help you find out ways that you can be more a part of the work that we're doing on campus. So after all of that, with no further ado, Cynthia Miller-Idriss is a professor in the School of Public Affairs and in the School of Education at the American University in Washington, D.C., where she is also the founding director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, aptly named PERIL, and I'm hoping we'll be hearing more about that with this talk. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Cynthia. Please welcome our guest.
Thank you. Great. My microphone's live, I think, so I'm going to walk around a bit, which is a pedagogical trick I learned as a junior professor to keep people awake. So hopefully it will work on you too. I thank you, Linda, for that kind introduction, for having me here. It's really delightful. Yale's a special place to me and my family. My parents met here many, many years ago as graduate students, and I was dragged here every summer to look at all the special local corners where they spent time, and have never given a professional talk here. So it's nice to be back in a professional capacity, and I'm really pleased to be here. That note, I will say, obviously, I have a note here saying there's a lot of offensive images. I want to warn you about that and apologize for that, and also remind you, particularly those of you who are online sometimes and in the audience, people take a picture of something or a screenshot to share in a shared kind of outrage. And my request is that we not share on social media the ones that are propaganda. So you'll see what I mean pretty quickly. But one of the things I found is sometimes people do that and then they end up helping spread some of the propaganda themselves. Okay, I'm going to review, there's a couple of slides of text, and then I promise the rest of it is really image rich. So along with me moving around, hopefully that will help. But I want to talk a little bit about the threat landscape. I use the term far right in the book, and in my work, although I call it the best bad term we have available to describe what I'm talking about. It's used in sort of global terrorism databases to refer to forms of extremism and terrorism, violent collective work and movements that are anti-Semitic, racist, misogynistic, homophobic, that are anti-immigrant, et cetera, that are supremacist in nature. In other words, set up hierarchies of superiority and inferiority in which the other group is seen as a threat and should be met with violence or suppression, or they're anti-government, anti-democratic. The reason why it's a hard term, a bad term, I think, is because in this political context in the US, it can be distracting to refer to far right and far left. But in the databases globally, you kind of have to use it. And so I mentioned that because it can be a little bit difficult. In the US, since around 2019, we saw that 2020 is the time we saw under the first Trump administration, the first acknowledgement from a US administration that domestic violent extremism was now the biggest and most lethal threat to the homeland. I always point that out because I do think it's important that it happened under the first Trump administration. 3 months after that, January 6th happened, and then of course the narratives got more complicated, but we did until then have 20 years in Homeland Security, almost exclusively a focus on international terrorism. And so while some of this was growing, even on the violent fringes, as well acknowledged that there wasn't really very much attention to it at the national level in terms of resources, FBI investigations, hearings held on the Hill, et cetera. And at that time, I was working exclusively in Germany. So I started my career with 15 years of work looking at school-based responses to resurgent far-right and anti-Semitic and neo-Nazi extremism among youth in Germany. And then after the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally got pulled into US conversations, and Hate in the Homeland came initially out of my frustration that policymakers in the US were asking questions that saw the far right really as the same way that ISIS was. So they would ask, like, what are the chains of command? What do the cells look like? What's the operational network? And as you'll see, what I'm talking about are not really organized movements, but much more diffuse propaganda streams that come in ordinary places online and that can still mobilize tremendous violence. So we have seen increases in political violence from the left and the right, increases in supremacist and anti-government violence over the last decade, having the highest lethality. Spikes are record-breaking in almost every category of hate crimes that the FBI collects the data on, and those trends, and specifically related to anti-Semitism, which we're going to talk about here, as you all know, rising and continued anti-Semitism from every direction, right? So it's not just the far right, although that is the area that I work on. Part of the challenge is that over the last 6 to 8 years in particular, we've seen a massive shift in how people experience propaganda online. It's less manifesto, more meme, less coherent ideology, more blurriness and messiness, what intelligence analysts call signal noise, in the way that people are exposed to hateful content and the way that they're mobilized to violence. And so that means a lot of recent, for example, attacks that might have otherwise be called terrorist attacks, like an attack in Highland Park near Chicago, the Uvalde, Texas elementary school shooting, the Annunciation school shooting in Minnesota, that all had perpetrators who were deeply immersed in highly online worlds that were full of hate, anti-Semitic, misogynist, racist, a lot of gore, fandom, sort of mass shooter fandom sites, that kind of thing. But the targets had no attributable connection back to those worlds. In other words, they chose a parade over the 4th of July, elementary school, another elementary school in Annunciation. And so you can't clearly identify them as extremist in nature, but they're still, so we call that now targeted violence. But it's a big shift, and a lot of gamification, the GoPro helmets. I mean, sorry, I'm going to sound very neutral in saying these kinds of things that are horrific. There are scorecard kill counts online, right? So gamification in youth culture online. We have intensifying vulnerabilities, which I'll talk about among young people, isolation, loneliness, disaffection, lack of agency. And part of what I look at, in particular in my lab, we look a lot at pathways to this content, and 3 pathways that I'll talk about and have talked about are gaming, particularly in-game chats, not the games themselves, but the live chats where you encounter very toxic subcultures, short-form video, particularly from influencers that young boys and men find through self-help searches, often asking for help with something in particular. Fitness, finance, or dating are the top 3. And then they often land on influencers who peddle subscriptions to things that offer scapegoats for their problems, often misogynist influencers, but also anti-Semitic ones, and sometimes both, like Andrew Tate. Okay, so this incubation, including, again, these horrific sites. I just interviewed a young man this summer who explained a website that he and all of his friends in middle school were on called The Gauntlet. Hopefully no one knows it, but in middle school where they had to, it was a game essentially that they played where you had to view ever more horrific types of violent content in order to advance to different levels, including things like cartel beheadings. And they did it right in the middle school hallways. And he said, a teacher would walk around the corner and we'd hide the phone. So, it's that kind of thing that I'm talking about, just not having to go looking for an initiation rites type of group or a manifesto. And a lot of that content and exposure to it, as young people explain to me and to others, creates apathy, a sort of sense of numbness, apathetic feelings, desensitization, and dehumanization. Okay, so when I talk about radicalization, meaning how does someone move along a pathway from exposure to mobilization to violence, radicalization is that part in between. It's a process of coming to accept an us versus them way of thinking that's existential, so that the other group is seen as a dire threat that has to be met with sort of suppression or elimination. And what we've seen, and what I'll talk about now that we'll get to the images, is very rapid transformations in how that happens and where that happens and how youth encounter those ideas and in what they look like. So when I first started doing work in Germany, I was in schools where sometimes 85% of students in classrooms looked something like this, right? There's the classic racist skinhead look, shaved head, bomber jackets, combat boots. I was embedded with civics teachers who were trying to address these issues in the classroom, and doing interviews with them about their experiences of nationhood and why they were in these violent movements or scenes, essentially. And again, apologize for the hateful scenes, but the rest of the world pretty much adopted it. This is in New York, right? So same exact scenes. This is a protest, a neo-Nazi group in New York at a gay pride parade. So you see the just clear adoption of the Nazi symbols, of the Heil Hitler, the swastika. I mean, nothing original about what Americans were doing at the time. But around 2002, a brand came on the scene in Germany, which then became an online brand in 2005, called Torsteiner, originally created by two guys who were friends, one of whom had just profit-driven motives, and the other was ideologically reported to be more connected to these scenes. And they basically transformed the whole scene. It's what people call the death of the skinhead. They created what eventually became copycat brands like theirs, but dozens of brands now, dozens of clothing, high quality. I mean, it's the difference between like a screen printed Yale sweatshirt and the one with the nice stitching, right? Really nice, high quality clothing that has anti-Semitic, Nazi references or racist or anti-immigrant symbols built in some way that toe the line of what's allowable. So using symbols like here, spelling the name Torsteiner all with runic symbols that were used by the Nazis as different insignia. The SS itself was a runic symbol, right? So it's towing the line of what's allowed. And this launched a whole series of other brands. This one here is called Ansgar Aryan. So you have the word Aryan right in the brand name. And this jacket followed from a 2011 legal case in which, so it would be illegal to have the German word swastika, Hakenkreuz, on the back of a sweatshirt. There's a different freedom of speech set of rules there. And so at some point there was a legal ruling that said Nazi signs and slogans are no longer illegal if they're in a language other than German. That created a whole market for clothes like this this is the Latvian word for swastika, that sounds very much like the English word, so it's recognizable kind of worldwide, and it says swastika European Brotherhood. What's really interesting about this, to point out a few things, this is around 2013 or so. It is 75 euros, so like something like $90, right? $100, like it's not cheap just for this little cotton jacket. It tells you all about here, the quality of the zipper and the cotton and how it's going to hold up in the wash. But the very first line here says rechtlich absolut unbedenklich, which means perfectly legal, right? So they're marketing the legality of these sort of symbols and the playing with the symbols as they sell the products. So in 2016, then we saw this really interesting iconographic T-shirt that puts the German word for swastika, Hakenkreuz, with the vowels removed in the logo of Run DMC, which if you're my age-ish, you might remember was a 1980s hip hop rap group. And they're doing that because an anti-racist group used the logo to promote a concert to raise money for anti-racism. So it's a troll against this anti-racist group in Germany, and also to see if they can get away with it. Huge legal debate happened. Is a word if the vowels are removed? That's basically what the debate was. The legal ruling came down and said it's not a word. So if they decided it was a word, law enforcement here, you can probably see there's some guys, I don't see any in this picture, but often you see at these kinds of neo-Nazi marches, tape over tattoos. Yeah, there's this guy, you can't tell very easily, but he's got some blue tape here. So they carry tape and then they have to put tape over something that's illegal. It can't be displayed. You're allowed to have it, but it can't be displayed. So this became legal to display, and that launched copycats, including in the US, where this brand, Certified White Boy, sells a t-shirt called Run DMC White Boy for $24 in the US, even though it would not be illegal to put white boy, in any way in the US on a t-shirt. There are nods around the world. In this French website, which, by the way, the website was called TYT4U, which if you sound it out is too white for you, right? Too white for you, is a distributor website that sells brands. These logos are from Poland, Ukraine, France, Germany, Russia, a number of other countries represented here, but you see the Hitler t-shirt right here, HTLR. So that kind of dropping out of vowels. So I call that the kind of game playing and coding part of what was going on at the time that kind of started to make trolling legal, police, law enforcement, teachers for school dress codes, stadiums that had dress code rules. It made it fun, right? You're constantly, it's like trying to break a ban of, a drinking age ban or get away with something. So the game playing nature of it kind of drove some of what was happening. Just to give you an example of a couple of other kinds of things that were happening at the time, a lot of alternative colors being used that were not the traditional black, white, red of the Nazi flag. You had references here to Reconquista, the 15th, as a spirit of 1492, the 15th century pogrom against Jews and Muslims that was, is referenced now in white supremacist groups as a kind of example of elimination of immigrants or supposed invaders. And you have things like, just this is an Austrian brand, we're not radical, we're just early. Pepe Fiction, if you knew at the time the ADL declared in 2016 or 17, Pepe the Frog to be now a symbol of the white supremacist movement because he'd been co-opted, not because he was created that way, and you'll see that in a minute. So playing on Pulp Fiction, it says Pepe Fiction. And taken together, all of this at the time with t-shirts kind of created a weaponization of youth culture, helped fuel this weaponization of youth culture that positioned the far right as a counterculture to a boring, triggered mainstream that just couldn't take a joke. And so they really effectively were taking on satire and humor and irony to be seen as and position themselves as kind of the more edgy, provocative subculture compared to a humorless group of parents, teachers, law enforcement, and the left in general. And it worked. I mean, it really drew a lot of young men in particular into the scene. So t-shirts are one thing, like you have to wait till someone produces it. Someone has to design it. You have to pay for it, right? These are expensive. They're not cheap. They're not screen printed in somebody's garage and sold out of the back of a station wagon at a concert. Like they're really not, it's not that easy to come by. They became like sort of collectibles in some cases. But by 2016 or so, by the time that Pepe shows up on the scene, t-shirts are still, of course, popular in that scene, but memes had emerged as a predominant way to do the same thing for free and much more rapid. The use of iconography to transform things like Pepe the Frog, who was just an affable cartoon frog created by somebody who had nothing to do with the far right, into an emblem of the far right by use of white supremacists, by putting him in all kinds of, iconographic representations of the Holocaust, of the Ku Klux Klan, et cetera. So Pepe the Frog gets identified by ADL as a hate symbol so that teachers could start to recognize when kids were using it as like emojis and in their Zoom avatars, etc. And then things got really weird. And this is a small and weird part of the subculture, but I want to explain how it works because this also happened with the Boogaloo scene, the anti-government extremist movement that killed was responsible for the deaths of 5 officers in the summer of 2020. Like this transformation from meme to mobilized action happens in a couple of places. So in this example, someone, in the way that only youth culture can explain online, discovered that there's an Egyptian god of the frogs named Kek. Okay, and Kek is used in international gaming communities, in some cases, as a replacement for LOL for online laughter because of the way keyboards work internationally. So people were already using the phrase Kek. Kek is the Egyptian god of the frogs. Someone creates some fake republic called the Republic of Kekistan, creates a flag that looks a little bit like the Nazi flag and makes Pepe Lord Kek. Starts to spread around a little bit, right? It seems ridiculous, sort of online culture until that flag actually starts showing up in places. So in the left up here, that's at the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally. Here it's at a far-right demonstration in Sao Paulo, Brazil. In the center up here, it's in London, and here you can see the similarities to the Nazi flag in the inset. And at the bottom, probably, I would say the single most shocking moment of my career so far was watching the live stream of the January 6th attack at the US Capitol and seeing the Kekistan flag wave right there. So they start referring to themselves as meme war veterans, right? Or meme-based mobilization. And so this is what I mean when I was sort of frustrated with the questions I was getting asked about like the cells and the operational reporting structures of the terrorist groups, which like ISIS does have. But a lot more of what we were seeing at that time was individuals, and I said this earlier today, going back all the way to Oklahoma City, every terrorist attack that's been executed on the white supremacist side has not been at the hands of a formal member of an extremist group because the FBI generally breaks those plots up. Law enforcement is able to do that with monitoring and surveillance and infiltration. But how do you infiltrate this, right? This is not. And so we have Poway, we have a synagogue in California, we have El Paso, we have Pittsburgh, we have all of these kinds of mobilizations, the Charleston church shooting that started with a Google search when he looked for black on white crime and then got taken to a white supremacist website and got false crime statistics and then thought he had to mobilize. And so it's a different type of world that's much harder to intervene. And so that's why I founded the lab, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But basically, just to sum up what the book does, so what I tried to do in the book was pick case examples of places and spaces where entry points happen for young people online, or for anyone really, in ways that might surprise you. So this is a screenshot from a German YouTube cooking show called Balaclava Kitchen, in which these neo-Nazi guys wear balaclavas and cook vegan. It's a vegan neo-Nazi show. They're chopping up zucchinis and potatoes here and spewing kind of anti-immigrant content, right? So I was saying earlier, a friend of mine told me about a drywall series of videos he watched to learn how to install drywall in his garage, 12 video series, and 3 in, the guy starts spewing a bunch of anti-immigrant stuff, but he was stuck in the project now. And by the time he got to video 12, it was full on neo-Nazi content, right? Like New World Order revolution coming. So there's deliberate ways to find sort of people in their hobbies, but also to connect with other young people who have the same hobbies, right? And so it's not all serious all the time, and that makes it more fun. So this is true of the mixed martial arts world. I have a chapter on that, which is, you have to be very careful about. It's the fastest growing sport in the world. The vast majority of people who engage in combat sports have nothing to do with it, but there is a recruitment path within it, and an active club, a growing active club. And there were 3 or 4 at the time I wrote the book, gyms owned and operated by neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine, Canada, and elsewhere, that were monitored in the European context by law enforcement authorities. European Union. Here in the US, of course, it's a little bit different, and they're not tied to official groups, but they've become hubs of recruitment. And some of them have like live stream tournaments that are, run here, Reconquista Club, that Reconquista word again, if you remember that pogrom That's the name of the club in the Ukraine that in Ukraine that was running these. And so they become a kind of festival-oriented training grounds, but also live stream tournaments where they also get together. And then the whole rise of Instagram and social media, as I talk about in online worlds, and we'll talk about that more in the prevention. So, okay, what can be done? Now I want to turn it to like the happier part of the talk, if you will. So that's just to explain the kind of what I talk about in the book is this landscape, the shifting landscape, the impossibility of preventing mass violence or harm in the traditional way, right? So as I said earlier today, one of my close colleagues who was a senior counterterrorism official under the Biden administration, I've heard him twice say to me, you know, it's not my job to stop a person from becoming radicalized. It's my job to stop a radicalized guy from picking up a gun. And so that's been the US's official approach. And it makes a lot of sense in a context where you want to protect free speech. And it's an impossible ask for law enforcement, even in the best circumstance. And so we argue that we have to start taking the approach that other countries take, which is to invest in a more public health style approach. The idea is you do not just invest in the treatment of cardiac disease or diabetes once it manifests, you also create pathways to educate communities about healthy eating and exercise choices, and you help make sure there are not food deserts and to reduce the incidence of disease. And so creating kind of digital media literacy moves beyond the idea that preventing mass violence is only about how good we are at building fences, that we also reduce some of the flow while still protecting free speech. So I'm happy to talk a lot about why we think that's so important and how you do it. So again, it's early education rather than treating the symptoms. It's holistic, whole of community. It works. We work a lot on my side of the lab, I say, because there's a video-based and a community-based. I do the community-based work with parents, teachers, mental health counselors, faith leaders, coaches, and more. And we do a lot of evidence, right? So I'll talk about the evidence. Like it's important that it's an evidence-based commitment, that we test things. We started with a guide in partnership with the Southern Poverty Law Center at that time in 2020, when everybody went online to help parents understand what kids' online worlds were. That's the first thing we did. I'm going to skip through this slide and just get to the videos because I think this will be the most interesting for this audience. We also simultaneously launched a video-based division, initially funded by Jigsaw at Google, who doesn't fund this work anymore, but they were funding investments in preventing online radicalization and harms at the time. And they funded 2 or 3 teams that stood up and partnered with us, stood up to test different types of video-based interventions for online worlds. And our type is called, we call it pre-bunking now in colloquial terms, but its academic term is called a video-based inoculation or attitudinal inoculation. It's a way of trying to create resilience before kids in particular encounter harmful content. It counters manipulative tactics and rhetorical strategies rather than addressing the ideology itself. What happens when you do that is that kids and adults also tend to reject the ideology, but you're teaching them how to do it rather than what to think. So just to say how it works, right? It introduces a weakened version of the harmful idea. We call that a microdose. You have to get a little weakened version of it so that you see it while explaining what the manipulation tactics are in that type of idea. It develops emotional antibodies, creates cognitive resistance before exposure, and kind of prevents those harmful ideas from taking root. So one of the big ones we teach about is transfer, for example. Transfer is a propaganda tactic. The terrorist group Hamas uses it, for example, to teach, to use iconography of liberation movements that people associate with positive things, like the women's rights movement or the civil rights movement are typically associated with positive things, and use the same iconography to get someone to transfer those positive feelings to this while using misinformation. So by teaching people how transfer works, you can start to learn. And I talked about on PBS NewsHour this week on Monday in a video that has since gone a little bit viral apparently. And so you may have seen it. And so because of the video, not because of what I said, but because of the examples that they used from similar kinds of things that are happening with iconography right now, coming out around Homeland and defense of the nation and invasion, et cetera. This sort of idea builds on the notion that there are a bunch of things attacking our kind of psychological immune system all at once right now. And these are the vulnerabilities that we talk about. We know that young people are experiencing a lot of social isolation. I mean, everyone is, but particularly young people. The data is really bad on loneliness. And as you probably know, the data on how little time teenagers spend with other people every week is the lowest it's ever been. It's like 2 hours outside of school, right? And so they're just spending much more time online in isolated ways that make them feel socially connected, but also actually reduce social connections and their exposure to more diverse perspectives because of how what we call echo chambers work. There's heavy screen use that creates digital overload. What we call echo chambers means people are restricted from the kinds of things that might offer them different perspectives or challenging viewpoints. There's a lot of identity uncertainty in this generation, and then a decline in shared civic spaces, which also weakens like community resilience. So as we do this, it happens in 3 steps. And I'm going to talk it through for how we do it for anti-Semitism, because we have a division that produces 4 videos a year right now, which you can probably find online, and I am happy to direct you to. First, we have a whole team that what we call code booking that maps the propaganda for any given topic. So what's happening with anti-Semitism right now? We look for 3 things. What's moving quickest from fringe to mainstream spaces? What seems to be most salient? And what's emergent, essentially, those 3 things. So not an established belief, but something that is relatively newer. And so something like after October 7th, one of the ones we countered was the idea that ordinary Jews are responsible for the actions of the state of Israel, right? And so we used then an example of a synagogue being attacked in the video to as the microdose, and then taught a manipulation tactic to counter it. We monitor the social media spread and we analyze those manipulation tactics. So once we have that code book, then we decide, what's the biggest bang for the buck? We work from the top down with however much funding we have and counter the narratives. We create a targeted video, work on the manipulation content, and provide factual counter narratives. So we tell them why it's wrong. All happens in somewhere between 30 seconds to 1 minute. And then we test it. So for the quantitative nerds in the room, I'll just say we test it like our anti-Semitism videos. We test on Prolific, a platform with about 5,000 college-age students right now, to make sure the most important thing is that they don't backfire. A lot of initiatives to counter anti-Semitism have had a backfire effect, unintentionally, meaning they actually cause people to believe the conspiracy more. And so we tested 4 videos last year. 1 had a backfire effect, and so that gets shelved. It's really important to have evidence because you can actually make things a lot worse. So here's some of the results from last year's videos. We found that those 5,000 young people with just a 1 and 10-second video got 17.7% better compared to a control group. So these are randomized control experiments. The control group watches a totally different video that doesn't have any ideological content. 17.7% better at spotting manipulation, 11.3% better at understanding the awareness of a threat of manipulative actors trying to change your mind. We have a whole layer of emotions that we know reduce persuasion. So protective disgust, protective anger, irritation, and fear, those all increased, and those are good. You want those things to go up when they see a video like this. And then my favorite part is action. We saw 7.3 decrease in support for anti-Semitism in our most effective one, and the best one was I've never seen a result like this, so we checked it a lot of times, and it may never get it again, but we got a 24% increase in the likelihood to challenge the idea if they heard someone else say it. And so that, to me, that's a really important finding that says that we have some active rather than passive protection from these videos, and that we can create a ripple effect. So after we got the evidence, we rolled those videos out over social media by working with a team of social media influencers who get paid to distribute videos like this. And We got them out into 250,000 young adults in major metropolitan areas. We measure a lot of different things. We're now working on getting it out to bigger scale. But the idea here is that if we got it to 1 million people, you would have, out of those 1 million people, 73,000 fewer people who accept the anti-Semitic idea, and 240,000 or so more people who would be willing to challenge it if they hear it, right? So those are pretty good effects. It's still, it's not free. So like it still costs money, it takes time. If it should be scalable with the more we do it, the shorter the time to completion gets, and the easier it gets to scale up. So we're also measuring a bunch of different things that I can talk about in terms of how many people watch it, what are the engagement metrics like, right? Typical things. We analyze the cost per production. I think it's something like now 11 cents per view, but that of course depends on how many people view it. And over time, we are we're hoping that we can track what's called decay. So I'm going to talk just in a minute about the community side of the lab. We know on the community side that, for example, we do have longitudinal studies that parents, caregivers, and other community guardians like teachers, mental health counselors, they retain what they learn from our interventions for about 6 months, and then they start to forget. But my favorite data point I will say is that parents actually, so their willingness to intervene is dependent on their confidence that they can intervene effectively, and their confidence that they can intervene is dependent on how much they know. So if you increase what they know, they get more confident and then more willing to intervene with a young person who is exposed to this kind of harmful content. After 6 months, they forget what they know, but they stay confident that they can do it for 3 more months. So, which is like a great and amusing finding. So parents, their confidence stays longer than their knowledge. So we went back to the funder and said, we need a booster at about 6 months, just a little video we can send to these parents, remind them what they learned. And the idea is like, what's the optimal timing of a video-based booster message or a community-based booster message? So as I shift to the community-based interventions, and then I'm sure we're going to have a great discussion about all of this and what can be done and what it looks like. What we find is that this idea of psychological inoculation is super effective, more effective than trying to counter-argue, and more effective than trying to counter-argue with facts or ideas. We've known that for a long time. ISIS, government efforts to counter ISIS, Islamist State, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist groups with the idea that this isn't the real Islam, for example, just didn't work, right? This counter-narrative stuff either doesn't work or it's seen as part of a conspiracy. So you can't just tell people this is wrong and here's why it's wrong. Counter-arguing doesn't work. Sometimes it backfires. But teaching people about manipulative content while giving them a microdose of that and explaining very quickly why it's wrong does work. We've done it now for anti-vax content. We've done it for firearm propaganda that, for example, tells kids they need a gun to keep themselves safe from the government. So whatever you think about gun ownership, we want to make sure that people are making choices based on facts, not sort of manipulative tactics. We've done it for the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. We've done it for scientific racism. We've had a good impact, a measurable, statistically significant impact in every video we've done, except for the one backfire this year on anti-Semitism. And our first series of videos targeting misogyny did not work at all. And so we're back at the drawing board again this year, trying to find out what went wrong. We have some ideas about it that I'm happy to talk about in question and answer, but it just had no effect. So didn't get worse, but it didn't get better. We also know that you can't just address the individual. So the short form video is one thing you can do, but the rest of it has to be a part of an ecosystem around it. And so this is the part of the lab that I spend most of my time, that some of you will know about because I talk about it a lot. Teaching parents, caregivers, teachers, educators, helping to equip communities with ways to recognize what their kids are exposed to and build more resilient and inclusive communities. So the Lumina Foundation funds our work in higher education, which I'll signal here just because you might be interested in it. It's free. I mean, everything we do is free after we create it. Somebody has to pay us to create it, but then it's free to communities. So here, this is a toolkit that has guidance for like what happens after there's a swastika on your dormitory wall as, or stamped in the snow like Cornell had, or how can you respond better? How can you prevent those things? How do you build social cohesion in the wake of those events? And how do you, what not to do? So, for example, when white supremacist groups were paper flyering on university campuses a few years ago, right around just before COVID, it was the most common place where white supremacist paper flyers were showing up. I won't name the university, but there was a university that issued a statement that went viral for how bad it was, because they said, we have removed, they were like neo-Nazi flyers. We have removed offensive flyers. No, it didn't even say that. We removed paper flyers from the building, whatever it was, because they were in violation of the university policies on the use of adhesives on buildings. Right? So like the donors were upset, the parents were upset, the kids were upset, students, alumni, everybody. Then they issued a second statement that said, oh, and they were offensive, right? Like, it's just like, it didn't really get much better. So then by the time like Cornell had a swastika stamped in the snow outside of a dorm, but in public property, it was, they're much better. And that president issued a statement that said something like, a swastika was stamped in the snow this morning in a public area. It is protected free speech. We recognize that, and we stand in solidarity with our community, and we're here to support our Jewish students and colleagues, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was a way of, saying we can't do anything about this. And also we know we need to invest in ways to reduce and contribute to education. And they did some webinars and seminars and stuff at the time. So, there are ways to do this that can make people feel seen and heard and safe and included. And there are ways to do this that can make people feel like you're just towing the line on what has to be done. We have a curriculum for kindergartners through fifth graders that was funded by Department of Homeland Security until Doge cut it, but we got all the way through except the last $23,000, so we didn't lose as much as some other people. The Department of Homeland Security funded this curriculum to build digital safeguarding and literacy among elementary school students. It's a great curriculum. American Association of Pediatrics has approved it. It's aligned with all national, international learning standards. It's game-based, video-based, has these characters, Daniel the Duck, who teaches digital safety. It was in 1,000 New York City schools this fall as part of Cyberbullying Week, and it was created by undergrads at American. Super proud of that team. They won a national competition in my class and then went after a grant under the supervision of faculty in our lab and won $800,000 from the Department of Homeland Security, got hired by the lab, hired real consultants, educators, curriculum, pedagogy experts, got real animators. And it was a real lesson for me too, because I told them I thought it was too ambitious. But they'd bitten off, more than they could chew. And then they just did it anyway and swung big and won the whole thing. So it's a great curriculum. Some of them are still in the team and on the project. One of them is at grad school and still engages. This is a Peacemakers Toolkit that we produced in conjunction with the evangelical community, who approached us asking for help with what they were seeing in their congregations. And so that was a really interesting collaboration. We have not just a joke, so all kinds of tools, this one on preventing gender and sexuality-based bigotry. And we have a pilot project around the country called Care Centers or Care Corps members, who are like Teach for America members, who are deployed for 2 years out into regions around the country to help disseminate resources and provide guidance to faith communities and schools and librarians and others who are struggling with some of this stuff. Almost all of these are modeled after things that happened in Germany that I observed during those 15 years that I was there, and we're sort of testing them here. So the community tools are trying to learn from what's happening in other places, and that's how I'll end here with just saying, I think this can't be done in isolation. Some of our tools are translated upon request, essentially. So our first translation was in Portuguese because a group in Brazil asked for it. And we've done it whenever we can to try to create, with realizing it's not optimal to translate, and not adapt, but without funding, it's the most we can do is get these things in the hands of parents around the world who are facing some of the same online challenges. And really trying to see what other countries are doing to create these broader approaches that combine the secondary and tertiary kind of approaches of security and de-radicalization with a much more upstream prevention approach that is primary, like we have. We also urge a lot of exchanges with academics, with frontline practitioners, social work teachers, and not just security experts. So I spend a lot of time globally, usually briefing intelligence, law enforcement, national security officers. Only once have I ever gotten a chance to speak to teachers in another country. And I think that should happen more often, right? We should be able to get more exchanges going between frontline practitioners. So I'm going to leave this up here just to tell you, Western State Center, which is out in Portland, created a free reader's discussion guide for Hate in the Homeland with questions. These are our websites here. This is, you'll recognize this at Yale, I'm sure too. We're not officially allowed to have a website that is not the university website. So we call this our community-facing website, and this is our academic website. So this is the one you want to go to get the tools, because it's very hard to get in the queue to get something uploaded to the university website. It takes a while for good reasons that have to do with resources and accessibility, et cetera. But we want new tools to get in the hands of communities right away. And so that website is directed through your role. Like if you're a teacher or an educator or whatever, you can get in there. And I'm just going to note that I have a new book that came out in September that is mostly what I talk about these days on misogyny and political violence and the connection between domestic violence and violent extremism. And I'm happy to answer questions about that too. Although here today I was talking about hate in the homeland and our work combating those forms of anti-Semitism and other types of hate. So I talk fast. I know that was a lot. And I did not show the video on purpose, but I will get you a link to it just because we try not to let it go viral for bad reasons. Yeah, thank you.
Cynthia, thank you so much. I mean, this is some horrifying information, but I'm sure we're all glad to know that Cynthia and her team are doing such amazing work to combat these forces that we unfortunately see all the time. Two very quick announcements before we turn this over for Q&A. I forgot in my thank yous, a lot of people helped us to publicize these two talks, but one of them was the RITM, which is the Center for Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration. So thank you to them for their support and to everyone else who advertised this. I also always forget to say this, but we do have a reception at the end of Q&A. Please come eat some cheese and continue the discussion. And last of all, as you know, we have people also viewing online. So we'll be taking questions from the audience here, the physical audience, but also some questions online. Great. And you're mic'd, so you're fine. Who'd like to kick off with the first question? Clara.
Thank you. I get so much to talk to you so much today. So maybe drawing together your both Hate in the Homeland and Man Up. I was curious about why you're finding anti-Semitism and misogyny to be so much harder to inoculate against than some of these other things.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Well, I think,
your thoughts on
that. So my thoughts on the misogyny one, and I should say I told the students earlier today, I define misogyny not as hatred of women, but following the philosopher Kate Mann as the sort of law enforcement arm of the patriarchy, meaning it's sort of gender policing, can be done by women as well as men, can affect boys as well as girls by homophobic bullying. That's why the title is Man Up. So I think that's important just because sometimes it explains a little bit where we're coming from. So we, in the moment that we were, the idea of pre-bunking is that, this is going to sound very cynical, so just, but this is what I think happened. We don't know this for sure, but this is what I think happened. Pre-bunking works best before people believe something in the mainstream. We're in a moment where we have a Secretary of Defense who said we need male standards in the military, right? We have Mark Zuckerberg said we need more masculine energy in the workplace. We have a president who said, quiet piggy to a reporter, right? Like, I mean, other things, among other things. We're in a moment where there is more mainstreamed gender policing and misogyny happening. And for boys too, more looks maxing, as we call it, a lot of pressure on boys to, I mean, I know so many 10-year-old boys right now whose parents tell me that the kids are mewing, as you probably know, which is some not pseudoscience, either chewing stale gum or a tongue exercise that you do that's supposedly going to give you a chiseled jawline. And so they all get this kind of idea that, the gendered content that comes right now online is combined with some of the mainstreaming, makes it harder to combat it. We have to do it in a different way. So we're going to try it a different way. But I think it just didn't work to present the microdose that we did because it didn't seem offensive enough. So that, I think we thought it was offensive, and then it just wasn't. And so it just was like, people weren't, they didn't get angry, they didn't get disgusted, all those negative emotions, fear, that work to get people to reject, just like disgust works when it's a feeling that evolved to protect you from bad food, right? Not eating the wrong, you don't want to eat the wrong mushrooms. That's why you feel nauseous and disgusted. So if you feel a little nauseous when you view content online, that's not a bad thing, right? You don't want to keep doing that, but that's the goal. You want someone to not want to view it again, right? It's prophylactic. So, and people just didn't get nauseous, right? So they didn't find it disgusting. So that's upsetting. And maybe we just chose wrong. We chose the wrong microdose. We have to choose something more disgusting, right? So we're going to try again. We're mapping it differently. We're going back to the code booking and seeing what we can do. The anti-Semitic one, my only explanation for this and why anti-Semitic, preventative tools to try to counter anti-Semitism fail so often is because conspiracy theories are really hard to counter. You cannot counter them straight on because they often aren't, any intervention is seen as part of the conspiracy, right? So in our, I said we only had those 2 backfire effects, but that's not entirely true. We had a strange backfire effect in our anti-law enforcement one, that Boogaloo ballad of Henry Graves, which was showing how someone could get sucked into this Boogaloo movement. It wasn't strictly an inoculation video. It was a long animated, like an 11-minute animated short documentary story. And we tested it. And what we found is that 8% of the population we tested self-identified as members of anti-civil, like believed that there was a civil war coming already. That was a little surprising, except that it's also about the number of people who at the time, that was right between the election and January 6th in the inauguration. And so it was about the same number of people who supported the actions at the Capitol that day too, nationally. So it's roughly, probably accurate that there are about 8% of the population who thinks there's a coming civil war. For those 8% of the people, it backfired. They got a little bit more anti-government, not statistically significant, but slightly dug in their heels. For the other 92% of the population, it was great. So then we had this ethical dilemma. What do you do with a tool that works for 92% of the population, but for 8% of the population that might actually be dangerous? It could make them worse. And so we didn't release it. So instead what we did is we created an education guide to go with it, and we made it available to educators and teachers to use in the classroom. And I still use it that way myself to teach about. It has like discussions, like how do you talk about conspiracy theories? And we use my favorite conspiracy theory, which is a fake conspiracy theory, but then people started to really believe it, called all birds are drones, or birds aren't real. And so you can get kids to try to figure out, how do you know that that's not true? How do you know that that's false, right? It's non-ideological. It's a good one to go into. Also, it turns out to have been a fake, fake created, but then people actually started believing it. So that's our theory on backfiring. And in a way, the main thing is, if somebody is already a believer, if you get to people too late, you have to get to them. It's like, if they're already infected, the vaccine's not going to work, right? So if you get to people too late, you cannot pre-bunk. Then you're in a therapeutic intervention, which is something different, which is usually one-on-one discussions. You can pull people out of belief systems like that, but you can't prevent them from going down the rabbit hole in the same way. That's our theory on it.
Another question?
So something that struck me both about this, but also the SPLC, it's not just a joke guide, is that sometimes it can be hard to distinguish what a slur or a symbol means. Like it can, if somebody uses a homophobic slur, it could be a sign of youthful rebellious. It could be a sign that they're in the Westboro Baptist Church picketing outside my high school.
Yeah,
True
right.
story.
Yeah, they also protested outside of the university.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
At AU. Yeah.
And so my question is, with your videos, what specifically are you trying to target? And do you see any drawbacks to sort of a one-size-fits-all approach?
So in the community guides, the downloadable guides, we try to, it's also because like once you print something, it's already evolved, right? So like we try very hard to tell parents, for example, like these are the kinds of things you might hear, like not, we're not offering you like a glossary of code words that your kid might be using. But we urge parents, for example, if you hear something like this, you hear a kid say feminism is a cancer, or women maybe shouldn't vote, or actually feminists or like girls have it easier. That's an easier one. Or even like my kid said girl math, right? At one point, I was like, where'd you hear girl math? That's like and it's like casual and fun. And I get it. Like it's used by a lot of people, but how do you feel about, the implication in a joke that girls can't do math and that's why you showed up late, right? That's that kind of hashtag. And so, if you hear something like that, what we urge parents is just like, try to be as curious as possible without judgment. And that's really hard for parents to do. So like, can you explain how this works? Often it's better to start proactively, asking them to explain like, what are those new symbols in Instagram? I don't understand how to use this platform. My boss says I should be using it. Can you explain it to me? You put them in the position of expert. And then you can say like, hey, this is, I told you earlier, the number one question I ask kids in middle schools and high schools that is so fascinating. I ask them, we talk about algorithms, how harmful content comes to them. And then I say, can somebody tell me about a time when you saw something that made you uncomfortable that you didn't tell an adult about? And oh my God, like you don't even want to know. You can imagine all of you, especially the younger ones, like, what I'm talking about, right? They've seen horrific stuff. I was in a high school in March, and in that conversation, they started talking about this algorithm fail that Meta had on February 26th, which Meta apologized for on February 27th, saying, we're sorry for some users got extremely violent content, but all the kids in the classroom had gotten it. And it was like live stream suicides, murders, animal abuse, child abuse on their Insta Reels. And so a teacher sort of interrupted and said, wait a minute, are you telling me that you like over lunch saw a murder on your phone and then had to take my math test? And they're like, yeah, that's what we did. And so then like the whole conversation shifted, right? So if you can sort of get into a conversation about what the worlds are, it's a lot better. And then you can get to what the content is. Like, how do you avoid it? How does it make you feel? So that's easier on the education side, right? On the video side, where you actually are pre-bunking something, there's a huge debate that happens in the team. Not just the team, we have a production company we hire to create the videos. And they're like on our anti-vax videos, for example, where we're trying to reduce vaccine hesitancy at the time, which was not political at the time and now is, but we had a huge, we often animate the videos, right? So are we animating or are we using real people? Okay, we're going to use real people who are doctors. Should we use real doctors or actors? We decided to use real doctors. Where are the real doctors going to be in the video? These are 30-second videos. These are the levels of discussion. They're going to be wearing white lab coats in a family physician's office because that's the most trusted space. We partnered with the Harvard School of Public Health on those kinds of things. They ran a national survey to help us decide which are the most salient types of propaganda. So in that case, it was vaccine safety, and the issue of safety was the biggest. And so then you choose something like, we figure out like what's the kind of thing that's coming across in the that they're seeing online that might manipulate them into thinking something's not safe, right, or is scary. So in that video, we chose the colors and the music. We showed examples, a microdose of colors and music that's used in anti-vax videos that are known in Hollywood to produce like that kind of unsettled feeling like that you get in a horror movie, or the color of vomit, right? And crying babies, that's another one that's often in them. And giant needles, like the kind that were used in 1950s polio, like these big needles, like not the needles that are being used now. So those are the 4 things we showed in that video really quickly, the kinds of things. And again, we wrapped it up in 30 seconds. We ran that video on YouTube for 3 weeks, got it in front of 4.3 million people with a 5-question brand lift survey. that showed about a 7% shift in people's reduced hesitancy to take a booster at that time. So, which is not a lot, but when you have 4.3 million people, 7% is not bad. So all that to say is there's no easy answer except to say that it's like a huge debate. It goes on for weeks in the lab and the team that produces it. What's most salient? We map that first, that's empirical. And then how do you operationalize that? It's just like operationalizing any other research instrument. You know what you want to know. What questions are you actually going to ask when you're out in the field? It's the same thing. Which prompt do you use? And at some point it's more art than science, because that's the point where you're crafting a tool that you could if we had endless resources, you could create 10 of these and test the difference between them. But you have to make a choice.
Actually, I was going to take a question or two
Yeah.
offline.
Sure.
So a couple of people were asking about resources. So we had to take your slide down so
Oh,
people
yeah.
can see you, if you could reiterate.
Yes. So
and
it's,
then, sorry,
yeah.
one more from Tammy. Can you talk about the recent echoing of white supremacist imagery in music in recruitment for ICE by the Trump administration? And actually, there have been a couple of questions about the use of these images by the current administration.
In fact, while I was in between these two talks, this is the video that I was in that went viral earlier today. I was on PBS NewsHour on Monday night talking about that. So you can watch that segment. It's pretty easy to find right now. As I was walking over here, it had 2.1 million views on TikTok. So I was like, great. We have to notify our security on campus, just let people know there's a lot of exposure right now. But that means people are really worried about that exact question and asking the question about what this is. And it was a phenomenal segment because it put together, not because of anything I said, but just because how well they put together the series of imagery that has come out all at once. So that's the easiest thing. Just watch that video. It's 6 minutes long. But I can say very quickly that there's a couple different things going on in a series of social media posts and related kinds of things, like Kristi Noem's placard underneath their podium over a weekend that said one of ours is and all of yours, or something like that, which is a translation of a slogan or rallying cry that's been used in fascist contexts historically. So there was a lyric from a song that is popular with some white supremacist movements and had been used in a Proud Boys video, and the lyric is, "We will have our home again. We will have our home again." And so you can see it in the PBS NewsHour clip, the actual song, but you can also see the social media post, which has that over it. It's a Department of Homeland Security reference to immigration. And so this idea, and it positions, kind of an existential threat, the idea that there's been an invasion, we're going to get our home back. There's Western imagery as well, like a Western cowboy riding west. There's all kinds of that type of stuff happening. So it's very clearly, and this is your comment that I thought was great, there's some dog whistles and there's some just whistles, right? It's a great, thank you for that quote, Linda. It's yes. So that, and then the resources question, it's it's HTTPS, there's no www, perilresearch.com, PERIL research.com. It's all free, downloadable. You can get the tools there. You should be able to see some of the videos there, the ones that we have permission to share. And there's an email address there that you can email peril@american.edu to get any additional information as well. I think that sums up that.
Other questions in the back? And then Kay, I'll come up to you in the front.
I love your presentation. I came here completely ignorant, and I'm kind of astounded. And it was very interesting. I've got a simple question and a little more complicated question. The simple question is, professionally, you and your staff, are they psychologists? Are they sociologists?
Great question.
Are they educators? Who are they professionally?
That's a great question because it's intentionally as diverse as possible. So I'm a cultural sociologist by training, but I've always had a primary appointment until recently in a school of education. Now I have a primary appointment in criminology, Homeland Security, but a secondary appointment in education. And our director of research is a statistician. Our quantitative political scientist, our director of interventions, is a psychologist who also was a social worker before he went and got a PhD. Our deputy director of training was a school principal. So we try to have, as broad. We have research faculty, postdocs, and then we have intervention teams who are basically folks who came from practitioner worlds. And then I will say we have more than doubled in size in the last year, thankfully, because a number of funders have stood up additional support for us to bring over a number of people who were let go by the federal government and agencies that work on violence prevention, including 4 of the team members from the Department of Homeland Security, including our deputy director who's there. So he's was a West Point grad who ran counterterrorism at West Point and then directed the center at University of Maryland and then ran prevention at Department of Homeland Security, and luckily came over because as we grew, I'm an academic with no management training or experience whatsoever. So now we're 30 people, and we actually need people who know what they're doing.
I'm gonna come around to the front.
Get a follow-up question.
I just had a very quick question.
Yeah.
And then I'll leave you alone.
That's okay.
Actually, I'll be talking like, there's a.
Okay, thank you. And I'm a lot of people. I weigh almost 300 pounds. Very quickly, did you all use a social class lens to study
Yeah.
the population and what's going
Yeah,
on?
it's a good question. We study demographics. So in our community-based side, I would have to look at the data on the video to see what they collect there. I don't have that in my head because I'm not actively on that team every day. So I'm not sure about the video-based data, whether they have demographics on social class or education level. Usually we get as diverse as possible on all those factors. On the community-based side, the tools that I help oversee, we look at urban versus rural, we look at education level and income level. And there, it's actually pretty interesting. It doesn't always work the way you might expect. So, for example, our parents, 1,500 parents in our studies, usually 7 to 50 if it's a one-time study, 1,500 for the longitudinal ones. But pretty consistently across the board, everybody gets better in pre and post testing on the ability to recognize online misinformation, except for one group of parents, which is the most highly educated, and urban parents get worse. And the reason why, and I say this as a highly overeducated and urban parent, is because those parents come into the study so much more confident than everybody else that they can already do it. Then they, in 7 minutes on average of reading, learn kind of things that you learn here, how much more complicated it is online, and they get less confident. So the interesting thing for me about that is that changed our idea of what our goals were quite a lot, because we had been thinking, we're just trying to make everybody get better. But we realized some people actually you need to correct their overconfidence, and because they're never going to ask for help, they don't think they need it. But education itself isn't a protective factor against mobilization of violent extremism. It's certain kind of digital media literacy is, but just education level doesn't help you out. So they're not, they could be in a worse situation by thinking that they know what they're doing.
I will keep this very short. You show in a couple of the slides various references to guns, gun culture, mass shooting fandoms, the armed babe, slogan on one of the t-shirts. I'm curious about the intersection with gun culture in these communities. Is this just another subgroup that's getting tapped into by the far right, or are you worried that this will, this radicalization leads to that step to violence that you mentioned?
It's a good question. We have a report out on this exact issue, and we did an inoculation on it in partnership with Everytown for Gun Safety. So we found a couple of different things. We did find a high correlation between supremacist beliefs, so beliefs in the superiority of some groups over others, in ways that contribute to a belief that you can distribute resources differently, empower differently, and gun ownership. But we also found gun ownership on the left going up quite a bit at the same time, in part through beliefs that you need it to keep yourself safe from the government or from the far right. So it's this kind of rising, and that's true in pockets like the LGBTQ community, right? You've probably seen a lot of that in community defense language around gun ownership. arm up. And so it's not it's not as clean a line. But so it's where we see is the language around defense is what I feel like I worry about the most. The defense with gun, the rifles are often there in that kind of imagery that you saw on the Instagram post around things like defend your land, defend your family. You often see like those posts. One of the things I didn't point out, if you saw it there, it's one of the most interesting things about it. Social media has changed the nature of those posts to be softer, more engaging, but have guns in them, right? So you used to have like a lot of literally the stores that sold far right products used to be called like buy or die, right? And now they're like glass and steel and fake boxwoods at the register, and you could wander in by accident, right, and buy this clothing. And so and it's the same thing with social media, where you usually have like a blonde woman walking through a little field of with deer and dappled light in the woods, but then the text said there's a guy holding a gun with those little kids, and the text says defend your land, or don't mix racially, right? I can't remember exactly what the word said. So so it shows up in complicated ways, and it's not as clear a line, particularly right now, but there's an association, and there's especially an association with some of the conspiracy theories too. So the study that we did, I'll just say for those of you, again, who are academics, most of you might be interested. We partner with NORC, which is the National Opinion Research Center, because they do household surveys and panel surveys. They have iPads in families' homes. And so IRB approves it, of course, but parents already you can get questions into existing things. So you can get 14 to 18-year-olds, which is very hard and very rare in surveys to get. So we got 14 to 30-year-olds in that study. And so that report is also available. Youth Attitudes on Guns, it's called.
So I have a question online. As technology becomes more powerful and quicker, do you foresee a form of inoculation that would be rooted in the initial development or growth of algorithms, code, platforms, et cetera?
That's a really good question. If I understand it correctly, there's sort of two things I think I would answer that. One, I think that as technology evolves, we'll get better and faster at this, in part. And this is controversial, a lot of controversy in our field around this question, but in part because AI is going to help us develop this stuff faster, including the videos. And we're testing that right now in the field with rapid response videos. So for example, after the Annunciation shooting, there was some false information going around that it was someone Muslim. And so the idea, or anti-trans messaging that comes out right away if the person is identified as trans. And so the idea is you could very quickly turn out a video that could try to prevent what's called secondary harm in that case. That you can only do if you use AI, but we could, say in those circumstances, we'll use AI to produce the video. There's big environmental costs to that, and that's part of the controversy. On the rooted in the algorithms themselves, I don't know the answer to that. I have to think about it, but it's intriguing. Yeah, thanks.
We just lose our online audience.
I think it's the screen.
Okay, just checking. It sounded ominous and wanted to check. Any other questions out in the audience?
I'm curious about the videos in the schools.
Yeah.
How do they get to there? Does it have to be a whole system?
Yes.
Are there different ones for different
Great.
ages?
Yes. Yeah, there are. So that's a great question. Because curriculum is locally determined in the U.S., we and the curriculum for Duck has only been out for 9 months for that Daniel the Duck. So we're not formally in any curricular programs yet, because that would take more than we're working our way through the approval processes and various, school boards, et cetera, but that's totally locally determined. What you can do is, as an individual teacher, bring this resource into your classroom. And so, and then school districts can recommend it as a suite of resources for digital media literacy, particularly during weeks like Cyberbullying Week, which is how New York City got it into their schools. So in other words, it's still a teacher's choice to use it. It doesn't interfere with curriculum that's been approved that way by the school board, but these new resources are out that are tested, that are evaluated. We evaluated them and with 400 400 kids in classrooms to make sure they worked. They improved media literacy. They built more knowledge, made kids more skeptical of content and of who a stranger would be, for example. And so, yes, we start in kindergarten and there's different videos. There's different focus for each grade. It's 24 lessons available across the 6 grades if you count kindergarten. So it's like 4 hours of content essentially per grade. So it's just a start, right? It's just a real scratch the surface. But, you know, I will say like one of the most fun things I've done recently in weird ways is go out to Hollywood to meet with some people who are content producers to see if like, I don't know, could we get like Daniel the Duck to be like, what would it mean to get Daniel the Duck's character, for example, the new Smokey the Bear for, you know, like we need a character that, you know, and then so we said like, how hard would it be to get Daniel to show up on like Sesame Street or pop into like another, you know, can that be done? Like, can he be the little, or some character like him? Can we get a digital safety character the kids recognize the same way that like, I still see Smokey the Bear and think stop, drop, and roll. Like, I just can't get it out of my head ever, right? Like, and so what are the things that we can build like that would help kids think twice before you click or tell a grown-up? That's like what the most important thing we tell kids. You see something you feel uncomfortable with, tell a grown-up. And in all the high schools and middle schools I've been to, I always ask them that question. And I say, has anyone told the grown-up what you've seen? And only twice has a kid raised their hand, and both times they lost their phone, right? So the parent took the phone away, and that's why they don't do it. So, you know, that's one of the things we tell parents is like, I understand the impulse, and of course you want to take away the phone or delete the app, but like, that also creates its own set of problems. And so, but telling a grown-up is like the most important thing that we think kids need to learn to do. And that only works if grown-ups take non-punitive measures when they hear it.
I'm going to take one more from online, and then I'll take yours, and then maybe we will wrap up. So this is an involved one. If today's far right looks to Nazi ideology, and Nazis once looked to the United States for the racial and legal models like Jim Crow, eugenics, et cetera, what responsibility does the United States have to, sorry, I gotta make this bigger.
Yeah.
Sorry. Let me get this right. What responsibility does the United States have to confront that lineage directly in order to meaningfully reduce modern anti-Semitism and extremist movements?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I don't know if I have a good answer off the top of my head on terms of like the gauge of responsibility, but I will say what I often say in a question, in response to a question like this, is that, you know, we landed on a global list of backsliding democracies in 2021, late 2021, and for the first time ever. And according to a lot of other metrics, it's not a great group of countries to be on the list with, right? And so like, I'm like any other nerdy academic, the first thing I did was like, well, what does that mean, right? Like, what's the data and how long do countries stay on it? So it turns out that countries stay on it on average for 9 years before they go off it one way or the other. Like either you collapse and you're not a backsliding democracy anymore, you're just not a democracy, or you're restored. And so I have repeatedly said, like, this is not a short term, like, we're in it for a decade, right? But now we're like 4 years into that story of 9-year average. So we're still not even at the halfway point of what the data would show would lead to democratic collapse. But we're still backsliding, right? We're still slipping down the slope. So the question is like, what does it take to turn the brakes on? I think the other thing I would say is like, I spend a lot of time in Germany, and, you know, we spent a lot of money in Germany building the Marshall Plan and helping them shore up democracy after the Holocaust. And like, I got approached at the German embassy a couple of months ago by one of the heads of their research, you know, scientific funding agency, who said, do you feel safe? Right? Would you like, you know, they have emergency visas now for academics, right? Like scholars at risk. I mean, I can get one if I want one. That's a wild thing. Like, we are hosting a scholar at risk from Afghanistan right now. And I have another country asking, I mean, I've now had several offers for visas if we have to leave, which might happen. So I think there is a moment when I would like to see other countries who are making those kinds of offers also think about like a reverse Marshall Plan. Like, what would it take to invest in societal-wide resilience to reduce political violence, support for it, likelihood to commit it, and shore up other kinds of democracies? And we're not seeing that yet. We're seeing outrage and fear and concern. But I think that if we had, for example, Rand has shown something like, I don't want to get the number wrong, but it's a massive percentage of white supremacist propaganda that circulates globally in English comes from the US, most of it from Texas, in the geotagging, and because it's produced by a particular set of groups. Like if that was happening for any kind of ISIS propaganda, we would, as a globe, be really mad at the country that was allowing that to get exported. And we don't get held accountable in the same way. So I do think that there's something to be said for other countries, investing in help at some point, but it's not happening yet.
Last question.
Thank you. I'm the only thing holding you back from the reception. Sorry about that. I was just curious. So I did read recently that if you believe one conspiracy theory, for instance, you're much more likely to believe other conspiracy theories. So it's a very simple question, but did you see in your data that if you address one of them, does that move the pin on any other issue?
Yeah.
And what are the mother issues in a sense? Like what are the umbrella issues that need to be moved?
Yeah, it's a great question. We specifically test for what's called blanket of protection effect. And that is if you inoculate or you immunize people against one type of hate or harm or tactic, basically propaganda tactic is what we're studying here. Do you get a blanket of protection effect? And you do. And so that's great news, right? Bang for your buck. So it works on things like cherry picking, like teaching, people how to recognize good data sources, scapegoating, fear mongering. There's a couple others that we've tested. There's about 6 of them, which are, propaganda tactics, and also some of the tropes that we teach about, like DYOR, do your own research. That's a really common one, right? That is used to prop up, like, I'm not telling you what to believe, do your own research, but you'll come to the same conclusion I am, that, there's lizard people out there, right? And so there's a blanket of protection for a lot of this kind of stuff. Now, how long it lasts, it's not as robust. Like those are questions. And I'll just leave you with a story. I gave a talk at a Holocaust Memorial Museum recently, and I learned this like sort of firsthand because it's survivors, family members in the audience. It's a really robust and moving group of people talking about this book. And first question, this woman comes up to me afterward with her daughter, so she's very elderly, and she said, thank you for talking about it's so important that people understand anti-Semitism, but I want to know, how do you know that that the conspiracy theories you're talking about are false? And she said, because, for example, vaccines, they're putting trackers in you. And I thought, okay, like there's no blanket of protection for this woman, right? So like she really knows about anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and believes that they're, but like totally went down this rabbit hole on like vaccines the government's tracking you with the vaccine. So, it's not like it's complete, right? It's statistically, it's useful and you can get a blanket of protection, but still, you're not totally immune from one conspiracy theory just because you are resilient or you experience the effects of another, right?
Wow. Thank you so much. If you'll join me in saying thank you to our speakers.
Yeah.